Pondering History 2. Where did Confederate pride come from? I am an over-60s boomer who's been thinking for a number of years the American public has been manipulated. Manipulated in order to divide and weaken our culture. It is my belief that current Americans have been fed a distorted history of our country and pertinent social issues. Separate conversations with two African American men significantly influenced my thinking. The topic for the first was the first movie shown in the White House. I'll say more about that a little later. The second was an African American man about my own age. He grew up in Baltimore and I in Wisconsin. In discussing our childhoods, we concluded how similar our family attitudes, dynamics, and interactions were. We also agreed that we felt that with the passage of the 1960s civil rights legislation, the country seemed to be coming together, that old racial wounds were healing. Another influence we agreed on was that the music we had listened to in our youth crossed racial lines. We both questioned why we are now so divided. During this presentation, I intend to address what I think are the reasons we have neo-Confederate statues and a controversy regarding the national anthem. Most of the thoughts that follow were formed prior to the events in Charlottesville. In recent years, I became aware of memorials to the Confederacy around the country. So what's the story here? Between 1865 and 1900, ladies' memorial associations were established throughout the South. Many of these were established to rebuild Southern pride, especially the pride of Southern men crushed by the Civil War. The most prominent, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, was founded in 1894. Some of the women published their experiences during the war. Varina Davis, wife of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, was one of the first. During the early 1900s, women such as Sara Pryor, Virginia Clay-Clopton, and Louise Riot began to publish the memoirs of a new generation of Southern women. Let's take a few moments to reflect on these Southern women of privilege. After her husband died, Varina Davis completed his autobiography, publishing it in 1890 as Jefferson Davis, a memoir. Kate Davis Pulitzer, a distant cousin of Jefferson Davis and the wife of Joseph Pulitzer, a major newspaper publisher in New York City, had met Varina Davis during a visit to the South. She solicited short articles from Davis for her husband's newspaper, the New York World. In 1891, Varina Davis accepted the Pulitzer's offer to become a full-time columnist and moved to New York City with her daughter Winnie. Imagine that, the First Lady of the Confederacy supporting the party cause for Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper. Varina Davis did her part to build the wealth that funds the Pulitzer Prizes today's media cherishes. Sarah Agnes Rice married Roger Atkinson Pryor of an old Tidewater, Virginia family. A journalist, he became a politician and was elected to both the U.S. Congress and the Confederate Congress after secession. Although they were not slaveholders, each had grown up with slaves, and he was a fiery orator in support of the institution. The Pryors moved north after the American Civil War with their family to rebuild their lives. Together they became influential in New York society, among numerous Confederate carpetbaggers. Mrs. Pryor was among the founders of a home for women and children in Brooklyn, New York. She helped found heritage organizations including Preservation of the Virginia Antiquities, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Mary Washington Memorial Association, and the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. She was active in fundraising to support their goals. Mrs. Pryor published two histories, two memoirs of the Civil War years. Her memoirs have been sources for historians on the life of her society during and after the war. Virginia Clay-Clopton survived two husbands. Her first marriage was to Clement Claiborne Clay, an Alabama attorney and legislator who served in the U.S. Senate and the Confederate legislature. The couple was imprisoned after the war, having been suspected of involvement in the Lincoln assassination plot. Virginia Clay-Clopton became active in the women's suffrage movement and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC, activities and intervention in textbook content, strongly shaped the memory and public opinion about the Civil War. In reflecting on these women, several things seem obvious. Wealthy families tend to marry into other wealthy families, explaining to some extent the sympathy of Northern Democrats for the Southern cause. Wealthy Southerners, impoverished by the war, were able to get assistance from family in the North. As wealthy Southerners, they had had time for formal education, much from the finest schools north or south. In addition to family ties, they could take advantage of school and social connections to get back on their feet. Poor Southerners did not have the same options. These Confederate carpetbaggers were in a position to significantly influence the public education system being organized in the late 1800s and early 1900s throughout the country. This phenomenon may have been a spark for a Northern Confederate pride movement. After all, the KKK in the early 1900s was not limited to the South. This time period is one generation separated from the American Civil War. It's important to point out that in 1860, our first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, did win the electoral vote, but not a majority of the popular vote. The opposition party was fractured over the issue of slavery. The Democrat Party, North and South, supported slavery. However, some Southern Democrats stood to lose significant wealth due to the potential loss of their human property, and they supported secession. Northern Democrats were dependent on Southern crops to supply their factories, but were more willing to give up the institution and save the Union. They were considered Unionists. New York City, as well as other northern industrialized areas, did not vote for President Lincoln in 1860. Could it be that one generation removed from the Civil War, some northern regions were still sympathetic to the lost cause of the South? Could some of the money for monuments honoring the Confederacy have come from northern sources? Was it northern supporters of the KKK that funded the carvings of the Confederate Memorial on Stone Mountain in Georgia? The sculptor originally hired was a northern progressive and KKK supporter, Gutzon Borglum. His work started during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. The three women mentioned above were all members of polite Southern society before the war. Let's look at someone from the next generation of Southerners who came north and clearly influenced our educational system. Woodrow Wilson was born in Staunton, Virginia, December 28, 1856. His father was a slave-holding Presbyterian minister. Both parents identified with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. They cared for wounded soldiers at their church, and Wilson's father briefly served as a chaplain to the Confederate Army. Wilson attended Davidson College in North Carolina for the 1874 school year, but his school year was cut short due to illness. Wilson then transferred to Princeton University as a freshman. In his second year, he studied political philosophy and history. He was also active in the Whig Literary and Debate Society and wrote for the Nassau Literary Review. In 1879, Wilson attended law school at the University of Virginia for 1 year. He was admitted to the Georgia bar and made a brief attempt at law practice in January 1882. However, he found legal history and substantive jurisprudence interesting, but abhorred the day-to-day procedural aspects. In the fall of 1883, Woodrow Wilson entered Johns Hopkins University to study history, political science, and German language. 3 years later, he completed his doctoral dissertation, Congressional Government, a Study in American Politics. Woodrow Wilson's academic career included teaching time at Cornell, Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, Johns Hopkins, and finally Princeton, where he served as the chair of jurisprudence and political economy. Woodrow Wilson served as president of Princeton from 1902 through 1910. While president of Princeton University, Wilson had discouraged blacks from applying for admission, preferring to keep the peace among white students and alumni. Wilson's History of the American People, published in 1901, dismissed lynchings committed by the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s as a lawless reaction to a lawless period. Wilson's History of the American People is considered part of the Dunning School of History. Wilson defended the Klan, writing that the Klan began to attempt by intimidation what they were not allowed to attempt by the ballot or by any ordered course of public action. Woodrow Wilson certainly had significant effect on American education, Ivy League and otherwise. But what was the Dunning School of History? Many Southerners and some Northerners took PhDs in history under Dunning and returned home for academic careers where they dominated major history departments. Those who wrote dissertations on Reconstruction comprised the informal Dunning School. Their interpretation of post-Civil War Reconstruction was the dominant theory taught in American universities through much of the first half of the 20th century. According to Dunning, Reconstruction's players included carpetbaggers, new white arrivals from the North, whom Dunning portrayed as greedy interlopers exploiting the South and dominating the Republican Party. Then there were the scalawags, native Southern whites collaborating with the Republicans, and finally the freedmen, whom Dunning portrayed as tools of the carpetbaggers with little independent voice. Dunning and his followers portrayed former planters, the elite political, social, and economic class, as honorable people with the South's best interest in mind. Dunning was a Democrat, like most historians of his period. The Dunning School and similar historians dominated the version of Reconstruction-era history and classroom texts into the 1960s. William Archibald Dunning served on the faculty of Columbia University in New York City from the late 1800s until his death in 1922. So Confederate memorials going up all over the South. Historians teaching Southern Democrats were justified in standing up to KKK during Reconstruction. Could this explain why the following events were not mentioned during my high school history studies or during discussion of the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement? 1. Free blacks who fought in the American Revolution were written out of American history. 2. The first black legislators in the U.S. Congress were elected in the South during Reconstruction. 3. Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government nationally. 4. Woodrow Wilson did not allow Buffalo Soldiers to fight with U.S. troops during World War I. They fought for France. 5. The first movie shown in the White House was viewed in 1915, Birth of a Nation. This movie portrayed black men as animalistic rapists and the KKK as the defenders of white womanhood. Woodrow Wilson was president at this time. Directed by D.W. Griffith, the screenplay was based on a stage play titled The Klansman, written by Thomas Dixon Jr., a friend of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson endorsed the movie, stating, "It's like history written like lightning. Sadly, it is so terribly true." This movie was a recruiting film for the KKK in the early 1900s. 6. The KKK of Woodrow Wilson's day attacked the black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You got to see Tulsa's Black Wall Street. 7. Early progressives rebranded themselves liberal after Woodrow Wilson left office. And 8. The KKK of Woodrow Wilson's day strongly supported prohibition. I first heard about the above movie in the mid-2000s from a History Channel program discussing the history of the KKK. Amazed that this had not been discussed during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, I spoke with a neighbor of 15 years. Bill was an African-American man, some 20-plus years older than I. He had previously told me of his local civil rights protest activities during the 1960s. Bill also had not heard of the movie nor of Woodrow Wilson's racist policies. As a baby boomer, I learned American history in the late 1960s. I recall the Reconstruction-era history curriculum, including carpetbaggers and scalawags, and that the KKK existed. It was not mentioned that the KKK was resurrected 50 years later in support of Woodrow Wilson's segregationist policies. By the selective telling of U.S. history, academia has been able to bury significant events in our history. While pondering this, writing several thoughts occurred to me. American colleges and universities during the 1800s and early 1900s were funded primarily by tuition payments and private donations. Public funding began in earnest with the GI Bill after World War II. It may be the American educational system supported the views of the wealthy as they who had the gold and paid tuition in American colleges. Certainly, they were the prospective faculty as well. 3. Confederate elites, their descendants and sympathizers, had a significant influence on the writing of U.S. history during the Progressive Era, this with a distinct Ivy League influence. Could it be academia was able to erase, or at least hide, negative elements of party and/or progressive history? A case in point, in 2015, the University of Texas perp-walked statues of 2 Democrat presidents. Statues of Jefferson Davis and Woodrow Wilson were removed from the university main mall. The Jefferson Davis statue had been placed in 1933. I suspect Woodrow Wilson would have approved. I would propose other monuments to the Confederacy could include Forts A.P. Hill, Lee, and Bragg, and McClellan. All stood up during the Wilson administration in support of World War I. Hill, Lee, and Bragg were all Democrat generals of the Confederacy. George McClellan was Abraham Lincoln's Union Democrat general who did not pursue his Southern brethren aggressively enough for Lincoln's taste. It is said that history is written by the victor. I am proposing the following exception may be true. History is written by the victor except when the powerful of the lost cause of the Confederacy are able to reestablish ties with their northern friends, family, and sympathizers, as they did during the Jim Crow Progressive Common Era. To my thinking, the white supremacists who showed up in Charlottesville are a cultural residue of the Jim Crow Progressive Common Era. Cast adrift by the party, they remain culturally insignificant without party support or financing. These groups only receive notoriety when the media grants them an audience. So why are we, the people, so divided? I don't think the United Daughters of the Confederacy is a problem. Today this organization primarily maintains documents of historic importance. Certainly, it's not the presence of inanimate objects in parks that cause problems for African Americans. It's not the singing of an anthem that Jefferson Morley claims was adopted as a result of a neo-Confederate movement. The concerns should be neo-Confederate policies that have been enacted. To my thinking, the Wilson administration was fundamentally a neo-Confederate operation. Woodrow Wilson believed slavery was acceptable on moral grounds. During the FDR administration, when Social Security and the Federal Housing Administration were stood up, African Americans were excluded from the benefits. This seriously impacted family wealth. It would seem Woodrow Wilson's neo-Confederate movement still held significant influence during FDR's administration. Oh yes, back to the national anthem. Jonathan Morley was right. See, in the early 1900s, the USA did not have a national anthem. Republicans wanted to use the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson ordered the military to use the Star-Spangled Banner. He may have been whistling Dixie, but he was not bold enough to propose that song. As for me, I'm still pondering history, and I'm also hoping some of my fellow baby boomers will take an interest in history reflecting on our own.